Good morning and welcome to our Sunday morning Bible class from the Central Church of Christ in Martinsburg, West Virginia. We are studying the book of Acts and we are up to Acts chapter 24. I want to thank you for joining this class and our live stream, whether you are at the church Facebook page or on the church website or through YouTube or whatever means you're using. We appreciate you joining in and being a part of our study together. We're going to resume at Acts chapter 24, verse 5. You remember last week we had studied in the first part of this chapter how that Paul was being accused. Here, an attorney by the name of Tertullus is employed by the Jews. That verse 1 says that after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with certain elders and with an orator, one Tertullus, and they informed the governor against Paul. So we're seeing the accusations being set forth in the next couple of verses. You see Tertullus give some greeting or some introductory niceties. Beginning at verse 5, though, he actually sets out the specifics of the charges such as they are. You can see that by now these charges are really watered down. Time has passed, and really the case against Paul does not seem very strong at this point. Let's begin reading at Acts 24, verse 5. For we have found this man a pestilent fellow and a mover of insurrections among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who, moreover, essayed to profane the temple, on whom we also laid hold, from whom thou wilt be able, by examining him thyself, to take knowledge of all things whereof we accuse him. And the Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that these things were so. Now on your worksheet there, have before you, we're on page 146. There are a couple of questions there at the bottom of the page following these verses. It says, number 1, identify from the list below the charges against Paul. The first one, he is a pestilent fellow, that is deadly. The word means dangerous, deadly, or annoying, and that would certainly be the first charge right out of the chute. It's to try to incite feelings against Paul. It really, when you think about it, doesn't specify anything. Just to say that somebody is dangerous or deadly or annoying doesn't really amount to much. But he goes on then, the next charge, he says he is a mover of insurrections. Now that's more serious, particularly in a Roman culture where order was such a prized feature of the day. A mover of insurrections means a troublemaker. And that is specifically a troublemaker among the Jews. And you can see how a lot of the Jewish leaders would certainly agree that he was a troublemaker because his preaching and teaching was troublesome to their position. The next one there is not checked off, a failure to respect the Roman law. They didn't even accuse him of that because there would be absolutely no way that such a charge could be based. But the next two are checked off. He is, they say, a ringleader of the, quote, sect of the Nazarenes. This sect, as they call it, is Christianity. He is a ringleader in the sense that he is a prominent member of the church. He was a leader in the Christian movement, if you will. So they call him a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And also that he essayed or attempted to profane the temple. You may have noticed the fact that here the charge is really watered down. They're saying he tried to profane the temple, whereas previously they had said that he did profane the temple by bringing certain Greeks in there, you remember, because they had seen him with Trophimus previously and assumed that he had brought him into the inner part of the temple. So by now, they're not even making that claim. They're just saying that he tried to profane the temple. How in the world he would prove something like that, I'm not sure. Question 2, Tertullus suggests that Felix will be able to verify the truthfulness of these charges by what? Well, by examining him, that is Paul, himself. Verse 8. And what did that involve? Well, it would involve scourging, a physical, severe, sometimes very severe beating, which was designed to extract information from the prisoner. The Jews would love nothing more than to see Paul subjected to a scourge over this incident. Page 147 at the top of the page, question 3, as witnesses for the prosecution, the blank also testified against Paul that these charges were true. That would be the Jews. The Jews readily joined in with what their spokesman, Tertullus, was saying. And so the prosecution basically rests its case. And beginning at verse 10, we have Paul's defense that's set forth. Let's read verses 10 through 15. Again, we're in Acts 24. And when the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, Paul answered, For as much as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I cheerfully make my defense, seeing that thou canst take knowledge that it's not more than 12 days since I went up to worship at Jerusalem. And neither in the temple did they find me disputing with any man or stirring up a crowd, nor in the synagogues, nor in the city. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call a sect, so serve I the God of our fathers, believing all things which are according to the law and which are written in the prophets, having hope toward God, which these also themselves look for, that there shall be a resurrection both of the just and unjust. So which word in verse 10 describes Paul's attitude in answering these charges? The answer is cheerfully. He says, I cheerfully make my defense, verse 10. And that's an interesting description of terms, and the fact that Paul, under these circumstances, could maintain an attitude of cheerfulness, of zeal, of readiness to answer these charges. Question 2, how long had it been since Paul was in Jerusalem? Well, the text says 12 days. 12 days. Which, if any, of the charges does Paul admit? Well, the only thing that he admits is that after this so-called way that they call a sect, and he was probably indicating by that you should put that in quotation marks, they call it a sect. The word sect is an uncomplimentary term. It suggests sometimes a splinter group or a division off of something more important. It sometimes has a very negative connotation, almost like a cult sometimes. But Paul says that's their word for it. Yes, I followed it, what they are calling a sect. And what is meant by that phrase in verse 14 really is Christianity itself. Yes, I will confess, Paul says, that I am a Christian, a member of this way, as it's described, known as a sect. True or false? True Christians do not believe in the Old Testament. That question is in this material because it brings out a very important point. The statement is false. Of course, true Christians do believe in the Old Testament. But Christians today, members of the Lord's church, are often accused of not believing in the Old Testament because they look to the New Testament for their authority in this age. We are told that the old law was nailed to the cross, Colossians 2, that Christ in his death broke down the middle wall of partition, Paul says, between Jew and Gentile, took that bond or old law out of the way, nailing it to the cross. But that does not mean that Christians don't believe in a study and a thorough understanding of the Old Testament. In fact, I would suggest to us that such a study and an understanding is absolutely essential if we are to properly understand the New Testament, because the Old Testament gives the buildup, the background. And it's necessary to understand that as a foundation for the new. You can't really understand what's happening in the New Testament if you don't understand the Old. So yes, Christians believe in the Old Testament. Paul here says that we believe all things which are according to the law. So Christians, if it is consistent with the law or according to the law, yes, Christians believe in that. That does not mean, though, that the law is still binding today, the law of Moses, that is, still binding in its legal effect, no, but certainly is fundamental to an understanding of the New Testament. And to what does the Christian look forward? Verse 15, well, the resurrection. And we see this as a consistent theme in Paul's preaching, how he emphasized a resurrection both of the just and of the unjust, how that all people will be raised to stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give an answer for the things done in the flesh, whether they be good or bad, Paul says. So that certainly is the hope that Christians enjoy, having hope toward God, he says, which these also themselves look for. That would be these Pharisees and these Jewish leaders that themselves were proclaiming the resurrection. Even though the Sadducees would deny that, Paul knew that many of his accusers certainly would agree with that. Verse 16 through 21, herein I also exercise myself to have a conscience void of offense toward God and men always. Now after some years I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings, amidst which they found me purified in the temple, with no crowd, nor yet with tumult. But there were certain Jews from Asia, who ought to have been here before thee, and to make accusation if they had aught against me. Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council, except it be for this one voice that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead. I am called in question before you this day. Here, Paul really focuses his defense and makes it clear that any fair-minded tribunal would have to find him not guilty because there are no witnesses in reality. These Jews from Asia that had been accusing him, they don't even show up for this tribunal here in Jerusalem. Question 1, at what did Paul exercise or work according to verse 16? Well, he worked at having a conscience void of offense, he says. What does that mean? Well, that expression suggests that Paul always lived and strove to have a clear conscience in whatever he did. He intentionally chose the path that he thought was right. Now, he didn't always make the right choice, as he himself would point out, but that was his goal. He says, I have exercised myself to have a conscience void of offense. And after his journey, what did Paul bring to the Jews at Jerusalem? Well, he brought financial contribution from the churches throughout the world that collected on his missionary journey. He brought alms and offerings, he says. That is this great collection that we read so much about here in Acts and also in the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians and in other passages, how we get the idea that Paul made this a very, very prominent and important part of his work. What was the true reason Paul was called into question on this occasion? Because he had had the courage to say that there will be a resurrection of the dead. And the resurrection of the dead was a central feature in Paul's preaching, as we indicated before. Today, our preaching and our teaching must, if it's to be pleasing to God, according to the Scriptures, it must include an emphasis upon the resurrection, as did the preaching of Paul. This monetary gift would certainly go a long way to soften their prejudice against the Gentiles, or against Paul preaching to the Gentiles, but it was the preaching of the resurrection that Paul continually stressed. Acts 24, verses 22 through 27, but Felix, having more exact knowledge concerning the way, and you notice that word is capitalized there in verse 22, deferred them, saying, when Lysias, the chief captain, shall come down, I will determine your matter. And he gave order to the centurion that he should be kept in charge and should have indulgence, and not to forbid any of his friends to minister unto him. So, did Felix know something of Christianity? Yes, the text says he had a more exact knowledge concerning the way. And the way there is obviously referring to the way of Christ or Christianity. So he postponed his decision until what? Until Lysias, and you notice the spelling of that, Lysias, the chief captain, would arrive. Claudius Lysias, a Roman. Question 3, in your own words, describe from verse 23 the imprisonment imposed upon Paul. Well, it was an imprisonment, but it was more what we would think of as a house arrest or a home detention. It was a type of situation where Paul was allowed to entertain friends. He could have guests that would come and minister to him. So this was really a softened form of imprisonment compared to other types of imprisonment that he had experienced. Verses 24 through 27. But after certain days, Felix came with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess, and sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ Jesus. And as he reasoned of righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come, Felix was terrified and answered, go thy way for this time, and when I have a convenient season, I will call thee unto me. He hoped withal that money would be given him of Paul, wherefore also he sent for him the oftener, and communed with him. But when the 2 years were fulfilled, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to gain favor with the Jews, Felix left Paul in bonds. True or false? Felix sent for Paul and heard the gospel of Christ. Well, that would be true. See, there are periods here of personal Bible study going on where Felix actually is coming with his wife Drusilla and sending for Paul and hearing him, listening to him concerning the faith in Jesus Christ. What areas of the gospel did Paul emphasize with Felix? Very interesting. He emphasized self-control. He emphasized righteousness, doing right living. He emphasized the judgment to come. Those three things. The very things that Felix needed to hear in his immoral lifestyle are the things that Paul emphasized, that which Felix needed. And which of the following best describes Felix's reaction to the gospel? Well, unfortunately, with Felix, it would be procrastination. He put him off. He said, go thy way for this time, and when I have a convenient season, I will call thee. We've all probably dealt with people like that. Don't call me, I'll call you. And they put off action that they should have taken. That would be Felix. For what was Felix hoping in leaving Paul in prison? See, during this time, why would he keep putting it off and leave him in prison? Well, the text says he was hoping that money would be offered to him. Remember, he had heard about this collection that Paul had taken or gathered. He knew that the man was a good fundraiser, and he knew that Christians were out there concerned about Paul being imprisoned, and he was hoping they would come up with money and that would be offered to him. So this shows you something of Felix's corrupt nature. He was hoping that bribes would be offered to him in return for Paul's release. Apparently that did not happen. Question 5, Paul remained for blank. That's 2 years. 2 years in prison. Now, it was a house arrest, but still it was a detention that was corrupt, that was uncalled for. It was certainly not justified by the evidence or by the case. He remained for 2 years in prison to the time of Felix's successor, and that would be Porcius Festus, the next Roman governor in line after Felix at the end of chapter 24. Chapter 25. Let me just take a sip of this water here. Now, I understand that Jack Williams left some of his water here, and he said that I may have drank out of that, but I noticed he did not tell me that until after the fact. What does that tell you? But anyway, we have made arrangements to be sure that we are observing proper protocol. So we go forward into chapter 25, Acts 25. We're going to move very quickly through 25 and 20, especially 26, because of much of that we have already studied in the prior conversion accounts of Paul. But here in 25, verse 1 through 5, Festus, therefore, having come into the province after 3 days, went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they besought him, asking a favor against him, that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying a plot to kill him on the way. Howbeit, verse 4, Festus answered that Paul was kept in charge at Caesarea, and that he himself was about to depart thither shortly. Let them therefore, saith he, that are of power among you, go down with me, and if there's anything amiss in the man, let them accuse him. All right. Question 1, who was Felix's successor? The answer is Festus. And does he appear to be a just man? I would say yes, from these verses, on at least outward appearances, he appears to be, because, he could have very easily complied with their request and gone along with their plot here. But he says, basically, if you have something to accuse him of, why don't you come back to Caesarea? That's where I'm going anyway. And those that are of power among you can accuse him. Also, if you notice down in verse 16 in this chapter, he says basically that that's not the custom to condemn somebody before he has a chance to face his accusers. He says, I answered that it is not the custom of the Romans to give up any man before that the accused have the accusers face to face, and have had opportunity to make his defense concerning the matter laid against him. That's a good principle of justice, isn't it? Before we condemn somebody or find him guilty, he should have the chance to answer his accusers. Well, that was a principle of Roman law that he was familiar with. So on the surface, it appears that he is a just man. He's interested in justice. True or false? During Paul's imprisonment, his Jewish enemies back in Jerusalem eventually lost interest in him. Well, that would be false. Unfortunately, these Jews were so deep-seated in their hatred against Paul and against his message. What does that say about the depth of their hatred, why it was so strong? Well, obviously, they saw in Paul's humble preaching of the gospel, they saw a threat to their own power, their own pompous position in the religious culture of that day. They took it to great lengths. Verse 6, and when he had tarried among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and on the morrow he sat on the judgment seat and commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews that had come down from Jerusalem stood round about him, bringing against him many and grievous charges, which they could not prove. While Paul said in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I sinned at all. But Festus, desiring to gain favor with the Jews, answered Paul and said, wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these things before me? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou also very well knowest. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if none of those things is true, whereof these accuse me, no man can give me up unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, Thou hast appealed unto Caesar shalt thou go. Let's pause here for a moment and look at the screen. We have the map there of Paul's first missionary journey, which we have previously studied. You can see that it was somewhat limited in scope there, covering the region just west of Syria, out across through the sea to Cyprus, and then up into the regions of Pamphylia and Galatia, and so on. Paul's second missionary journey, which is now depicted, was a little broader and more widespread, passing all the way through the regions of Cappadocia or Cilicia and Galatia and Asia, and then across the Aegean Sea over into Europe, Macedonia and Achaia, Greece, and the congregations that were established there before returning. Then we studied the third missionary journey, where Paul's travels were even more extensive, and he strengthened those congregations which were well founded and established. And the early church was greatly emboldened to grow and to really take a hold in that culture, which it did. Paul has concluded 3 missionary journeys, which we've studied. He's now back in Jerusalem and to Caesarea, standing before Festus and being basically played with. How would you go up to Jerusalem and there be tried before me so that these Jews could be present? Well, Paul knew that Festus' motives were not good in that. He was trying to gain favor with the Jews. There was no way, it was a no-win situation for Paul. And so he appeals unto Caesar. An appeal to Caesar would require a trip to Rome, where the prisoner was actually transported at government expense to Rome. And so the map there that's on the screen now is a map of Paul's journey to Rome, based on Acts chapters 27 and 28. I wanted to take a look ahead at this because this shows you the final journey here in the book of Acts, where Paul would actually carry the gospel to the very heart of the Roman world and would have an opportunity to preach to Caesar's household, where the gospel would begin to take root and make a revolutionary change in that Roman culture over the next several hundred years. All right. The 3 general charges against Paul, which are outlined here, this is question 1 at the bottom of page 149, were violating the Jewish law. Well, there was no truth to that. 2, profaning the temple. We've already seen that there was no truth in that. And 3, violating the Roman law. Well, there's absolutely no truth in that. So those were their weak charges, such as they were. And Paul sees he's not going to be able to get a fair trial, says, I appeal to Caesar. Festus may have been very, very sorry that he ever asked that question, will you go back to Jerusalem with me and be tried before the Jews? Because that triggers an appeal to Caesar, something for which Festus probably was not prepared, as we'll see. True or false? The Jews were unable to prove any of their allegations against Paul. That's true. That's true. Now, there's a thought question there. Given Paul's plea of not guilty, what would have been the proper action of Festus at this point? What should he have done? Well, if you are a judge and the prosecution brings a charge against a prisoner and is unable to prove that charge after the prisoner has pled not guilty, what should you do? Well, obviously, the charge should have been dismissed. The case should have been ended. He should have been released. Paul should have been released. That's what should have happened. Either produce the witnesses who can prove these things or set him free. Would you say that Festus was a politician? That word is in quotes in the question. I think we all know what that means. Was he interested in politics? That is, appealing to certain groups of people under these reasons of fame or power or prestige? Obviously he was, because the text in verse 9 says he was trying to gain favor with the Jews. Here you have a deadly defect in Festus's character. Even though he appeared to be interested in justice, he was also a politician, and he was trying to please the Jews, which is a big mistake under these circumstances. Question 4. Although Caesarea was the seat of Roman government for the province, Festus inquires if Paul would be willing to be tried in blank. Answer is Jerusalem. What was his motive for this question? Well, he knew that the Jews wanted this. He was trying to please the Jews, as we've seen. Given Festus's question, Paul did what? He appealed to Caesar. Such an action would provide Paul the opportunity to go to the city of blank, the city of Rome, where Caesar sat. Now, there's a very important note here at the top of page 150 that gives some insight into this legal situation. It's very important. Under Roman law, every Roman citizen had the absolute right to appeal a capital case. That is, a case that could involve capital punishment. To appeal a capital case to the emperor. In many respects, our English common law mirrors this concept in death penalty cases, making an appeal to the highest court of the state either expedited or in some cases absolute. Although appeal to the Caesar was permitted, the process was not without inconvenience and delay. And you can imagine the travel conditions in that day, how a journey to Rome, especially at certain times of the year, would be a major undertaking. And so it isn't just a piece of cake to appeal to Caesar. It would involve some real inconvenience and expense. But nevertheless, he did have that right, and Paul exercised that right under these circumstances. Verse 13. Now when certain days were past, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and saluted Festus. And as they tarried there many days, reminds you of some of your distant family friends who come from somewhere else and tarry many days. Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, asking for sentence against him. To whom I answered that it is not the custom of the Romans to give up any man before that the accused have the accusers face to face, and have had the opportunity to make his defense concerning the matter laid against him. When therefore they were come together here, I made no delay, but on the next day sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought. Concerning whom, when the accusers stood up, they brought no charge of such evil things as I supposed, but had certain questions against him of their own religion, and of one Jesus, who was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And I, being perplexed how to inquire concerning these things, asked whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be kept for the decision of the emperor, I commanded him to be kept till I should send him to Caesar. And Agrippa said unto Festus, I also could wish to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, saith he, thou shalt hear him. So what we have here is a very interesting interjection of Agrippa into this process. Agrippa, the king, is visiting Festus, the Roman governor. The Roman governor, Festus, has gotten himself into a predicament. He has a prisoner with charges against him that Festus really doesn't really understand the nature of these charges, except it doesn't seem to him like a big deal. And here his prisoner has appealed to Caesar, which means he's going to have to go to Rome. And Festus has said, you will go. You've appealed to Caesar you will go. But he's in an awkward position because he really doesn't have anything to specify against the man, to tell Caesar why he's sending him to him. So Festus sees Agrippa coming into this situation, interjecting himself into this situation, maybe as a way of helping himself, to maybe have somebody who's a little more familiar with the Jews and their laws and such, to get some information and to explain to Festus better what's really behind all of this so that he can write a proper letter to Caesar. And of course, Agrippa would just be dying to do that. Question 1, after those verses on page 150, note, Agrippa was the only son of Herod the king who killed James with the sword. You remember back in chapter 12, the first 2 verses, we read about Herod killing James with the sword, and he saw that pleased the Jews. Well, this Agrippa was his only son. Bernice was one of his sisters, that is, one of Festus's sisters. So he's actually married to his sister. That gives you an idea of the moral decadence of the culture and the royalty of that day, and of Festus himself, or rather of Agrippa. Of Agrippa. Bernice was one of his sisters. In describing the matter to Agrippa, Festus asserts that the dispute concerned not what he had expected, but rather involved matters of the Jewish blank. That would be the Jewish religion. Literally, the word, it's interesting, means superstition. So Festus seems to be sort of downplaying it, dismissing it, saying this dispute seems to be something involving their superstition. Was Festus truthful in giving his reason for suggesting a trial in Jerusalem? Well, not exactly. No, he was trying to please the Jews. That was his reason, really. But here he says that my reason was to get more information so I could write an intelligent letter to Caesar. So he's not exactly truthful on that. Betraying his own ignorance, Festus refers to Christ as what? He says, one Jesus. That's a very interesting betrayal of his own ignorance. He's saying, in essence, that Paul was talking about certain questions against him of their own religion and of one Jesus who was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive, verse 19. And I like Brother McGarvey's quote here. He says, Agrippa must have smiled at Festus's ignorance. Agrippa knew exactly who Jesus was. This was no stranger to Agrippa. Remember, Agrippa's family was very corrupt, and it was his father who had killed James with the sword. He was also connected through his family to many other aspects of Jesus Christ. He knew very well who this Jesus was. Question 5, what about Jesus was Paul stoutly affirming? Well, again, verse 19, he was affirming the resurrection. He was affirming the resurrection of the dead. That was a central feature of Paul's preaching, consistently. Hearing of the matter, in what does Agrippa express an interest? Verse 22, well, he expresses an interest in hearing Paul himself. I'd kind of like to hear this man myself, Agrippa says. That's verse 22. There's a thought question at the top of page 151. Do you suppose Agrippa had heard of Jesus before? Oh, yes. Of the church and of Christianity? Yes. Of the apostles, no doubt. Remember, his father had put one of them to death. That was James. Had he heard of Paul before? Very likely he had. And so this is his chance, although he couldn't have lowered himself to go and sit at the preaching of Paul in the past. This was his chance to hear firsthand exactly what this man is saying. Given the fact that Paul had appealed to Caesar and that Festus would be required to send a written explanation to the emperor, what was Festus's true motive in allowing Agrippa to hear Paul? I think his true motive must have been to help clear up his own ignorance, to get information from a Jewish expert, that would be King Agrippa, that he could use in presenting a cogent, clear letter to the emperor. Verses 23 through 27, so on the morrow when Agrippa was come, and Bernice with great pomp, and they were entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains and the principal men of the city, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus saith, King Agrippa, and all men who are here present with us, ye behold this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews made suit to me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and as he himself appealed to the emperor, I determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him before you, and specially before thee, King Agrippa, that after examination had, I may have somewhat to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not withal to signify the charges against him. You see, in verse 23, Luke uses the expression with great pomp. That suggests that these proceedings were very showy, they were staged. This is a political thing. Paul is not going to get an actual legally binding decision here that would be fair and just. This is just a way of putting Paul, parading him before Agrippa, to entertain Agrippa and hopefully to inform Festus a little better. In your own words, state the reason Festus gives for arranging this hearing before King Agrippa. And I have the word hearing in quotes there for the reasons I just explained. And that would be so that he, Festus, might have something intelligent to write to Caesar. He himself says, it seemeth to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner, not withal to signify the charges against him. That would have made Festus really look bad to send Paul to Rome with no clear charges. The emperor would have gotten very upset and would have probably jeopardized Festus's position with the emperor. Now, that concludes our study of chapter 25. I want to look just ahead. We're going to end our study there for this morning, but looking ahead into chapter 26, as I said, this chapter is a retelling of Paul's conversion. He himself gives his defense before King Agrippa. We've already studied this when we looked at chapter 9 and again at chapter 22. This information appears in three places in the book: Acts 9, Acts 22, and then here in Acts 26. You have to look at all three accounts together to get the full picture, because there are some details included in one that's not in the other two, and vice versa. But basically, Paul is going to make a defense before King Agrippa. Festus will interrupt him at times because it seems so fantastic to him. But Paul focuses like a laser beam on the king and getting the message across. And it's a very thrilling and interesting account. If you do not have the remaining worksheets for the book of Acts, that would be not only 26, but 27 and 28, those will be emailed out early this week, probably on Tuesday this present week. And if you do not get them or you don't receive those emails, just let us know. Send an email, please, to the church at info@ccocwv.org. You can find that on our church website. we'll be happy to send those worksheets out to you, and we're going to be finishing up our study of the book of Acts very, very expeditiously. Thank you for joining us this morning. Please stay tuned for our worship service, which begins at 10:45, and we look forward to having you in our attendance at that time. Thank you.